Pugilism began in the 18th century, taking place mainly at fairs and outdoor rings where shithouses from different villages were able to pummel each other while rich toffs placed bets. It was completely illegal, but that didn't seem to bother anyone, unless someone died, which occasionally they did. The last bare-knuckle boxing match ended in 1889 when American champion John L. Sullivan saw off Jake Kilrain after 75 rounds in New Orleans. Fights basically went on for yonks until one of the boxers was so knackered they eventually gave up. As a lot of the fights took place in sludgy fields, spiked shoes were permitted. These also came in handy for scraping down thighs. Given that it was also acceptable to headbutt an opponent, manhug them until they couldn't breathe, and gouge eyes with turpentine to cause temporary blindness, it's fair to say the aim was to inflict as much pain on your opponent as possible. It was a popular sport and attracted artists and writers alike. Charles Dickens, William Thackeray, and Lord Byron were just a few notable fans of the sport. Lord Byron's dressing blind took him 3 years to put together, using cuttings from various newspapers, books and magazines. The unseen reverse was plastered with scenes from his other great love, the theatre. It can be viewed at Byron's ancestral home of Newstead Abbey. The sport was also incredibly popular with the newly semi-literate masses, who devoured reports of the battles in cheap prints and the broadsheets. Testament to this is how many fighting phrases quickly slipped into common usage, such as "not up to scratch," "throw in your hat," "claret." The expression "throw your hat into the ring" dates from at least the early 19th century. One of the earliest citations is from an 1805 issue of the Sporting magazine, which reads, "Belcher appeared confident of success and threw his hat into the ring as an act of defiance to his antagonist." Up to scratch. When boxing first became a sport, there were no bells used to signify the beginning or end of a round, or girls scantily clad walking around with a number. The referee would scratch a line on the ground between the two fighters, and as soon as both men stepped over the line, the match began. If a fighter failed to do this, he was described as not up to scratch. In 1838, a new set of rules was introduced, which were known as the Rules of the London Prize Ring, and this coincided with a fight between Bendigo and Ben Caunt, more of later. The new rules were about bringing order to the sport, but were, perhaps, overly prescriptive, detailing how long spikes in a shoe could be, rather than just the rules of the ring. It wasn't until 1867, when the Queensberry rules were drawn up that we know today, that fighters got all soft and started wearing padded gloves and harping on about fair play. One former champion of England was Ben Caunt, born in Hucknall, Torquay on 22nd of March 1815. Caunt, the son of a Newstead Abbey gamekeeper, grew up in a family of 5 boys, and so it's no surprise that he quickly learned to handle himself. He enjoyed wrestling and boxing with neighbouring youths, and was pretty successful because he was 6 foot 2 inches. The average male height of the day was 5 foot 7 inches, hence he was a giant to most. One day, he was spotted lobbing youths around by Joe Whittaker, an eccentric gent known as the Duke of Limbs. Limbs also had his eyes on another handy fella, a cocky upstart from Sneinton called Bendigo, and arranged a sparring fight with gloves on. When this went well, an official fight was fixed for July the 21st, 1835 at Appleby House on the Ashbourne Road. This time, gloves off. It was a clear case of brains against brawn, a bit like Rocky IV, with Caunt cast as the nasty Russian and Bendigo as Stallone. Bendigo was lithe, agile, and able to quickly slip stance from left to right foot. Caunt was leaden, a beast of immense power, weighing in at 14 stone, 7 pounds, who also stood at 6 foot 2 inches. He had a sledgehammer for a fist, but lacked the finesse and grace to outwit his opponent. Caunt's tactic was to use his tree trunk arms as a kind of human vice and crush Bendigo to death. But the problem was, he couldn't catch the slippery bugger. Every time he got near him, Bendigo would go down on his knees, which in those days signified the end of a round. Eventually, Caunt lost his rag and lamped Bendigo good and proper as he sat with his trainer. It was declared a foul, and the fight was ended. The mind had defeated the machine. Caunt spent the next 2 years training. Though he would never exert the scientific discipline of Bendigo, the defeat had at least taught him to be better prepared. He did this by destroying local celebrity William Butler in 14 rounds, followed by a 6-round whooping of Boneford, before he eventually had the chance of another pop at Bendigo in 1838. Now that Bendigo was well established, he upped the stakes from £25 a fight to 100. This got a lot of media attention. Fortunately, the Fancy, the boxing fraternity, were so eager to see the clash, 2 backers stumped up the cash, and it was game on. 3rd of April, 1838 was set. The location, Doncaster, but details were vague, as there was always the fear of a fight being closed down by the police. The local inns were rammed, and it was difficult for the travellers from across the UK to even find a bed for the night. On the day of the fight, the match nearly didn't go ahead, after a local magistrate took exception to illegal brawling on his manor, so a new location was quickly sought out in a neighbouring borough a few miles south. Inevitably, some people got lost in transit, which would have particular significance for Bendigo, as his spiked shoes went AWOL and he was forced to wear a substitute pair of crab shoes, which weren't suitable for the muddy ring. The 2 fighters battered each other for 1 hour and 20 minutes until the 75th round, when Bendigo slipped to his knee. As he had not received a blow, it was declared a foul, and Caunt was proclaimed the winner. It would be the only fight Bendigo ever lost, and he would claim it was due to his shoes, which was a bit like when Man United got hammered by Southampton, and Fergie blamed it on their grey kit. As Caunt left the ring and was conveyed to his carriage, he was attacked by Bendigo's supporters, the infamous Nottingham Lambs, who dragged him off his horse and demanded he carry on the fight. But for the intervention of his own supporters, it could have got really nasty. In the end, he was forced to walk, blooded and bruised, back to his temporary accommodation at the Hawk Arms. Another match was floated about with various insults, challenges in the press, but nothing materialised because Bendigo, the eternal joker, injured himself while pissing around with his mates and so badly damaged his leg it looked as if he may never walk again. This was fortuitous in that it ended all the mithering about who was really the champion of England and enabled Caunt to establish himself in the ring, though this would not be without drama. His first title defence came against Bill Brassey, a provincial champion of Leeds and Bradford in 1840. It was a peculiar affair in that both men had chosen yellow as their fighting colours, though Caunt had also opted to enter the ring in a large Welsh wig. Clearly, being champion had gone to his head. The fight itself was scheduled for early in the morning, so the toffs could nip off and catch the afternoon races, which was probably for the best, as it took Caunt 101 rounds to fend off his opponent. Baron Brampton reported, "I never saw anything like it. Both pugilists were of the heaviest fighting weights. Caunt was a real giant, ugly as could be by the frequent batterings he had received in the face. His head was like a bulldog's, and so was his courage. While his strength must have been that of a Samson, but if it was, it did not reside in his hair, for that was short and close as a mouse's back." But success would be short-lived, as 4 months later, in February 1841, Caunt lost his title to Nick Ward after 12 minutes. Caunt was so big, the only way to survive him in the ring was to drop to your knees the minute he had hold of you, as this brought the round to an end. Lacking in self-discipline and unable to learn from past mistakes, Caunt lashed out at his opponent and lost on a foul blow. Quite simply, he just wanted a good scrap, but as nobody would fight him fair and square, he'd lose his rag. There was some dispute over this ruling, and a rematch was set 3 months later. "I mean to fight thee again and lick thee. Me brass is ready," Caunt declared. This time, Caunt kept his calm and took back the title after 35 rounds, receiving a pretty little champion's belt of purple velvet for his hard graft. He was carried back to his hometown of Hucknall in a carriage with a band playing behind him. But he was such a heavy bogger, the plank on which the carriage sat snapped, sending him tumbling to the ground and muddying up his pretty clothing, which consisted of a yellow muffler and plum waistcoat. He wisely decided to walk the last few miles home. He received a rapturous welcome, and his spirits were so high that when he reached his local boozer, the Coach and Six Inn, he heated a few farthings on a shovel and lobbed them onto the street, chuckling at kids as they scolded their fingers, trying to pick up the bounty. When the celebrations were over, he enjoyed a 2-year tour of America between 1841 and 1843, where he sparred with the American giant who had arms and legs strong enough for the working beam or piston rod of a Mississippi steamboat. It was a profitable venture, and crowds flocked to see them. But the giant, although 4 inches taller than Caunt, was not the 7-foot monster everyone claimed. During this hiatus, Bendigo had miraculously recovered from his injury, and a 3rd rematch was arranged for a sweltering hot day in September 1845. Caunt lost 3 stone for the fight, weighing in at 1 pound under 14 stone for the first and only time in his career. But everything else was as it had always been. There was the usual calamity over location. Hams were as rowdy as ever, and Bendigo delighted in taunting his opponent. When the belt was presented before the fight, Bendigo slipped it on, just to check it was the original. But really, he was taunting Caunt already. The fight itself lasted 93 rounds, which was roughly about 2 hours and 10 minutes, with Bendigo declared the winner after Caunt dropped to the floor without being touched and therefore, technically, had committed a foul. Caunt was furious, particularly as there had been claims against Bendigo for doing similar in the previous round. The fight ended so quickly that at first nobody was sure who had won, but the incredible bulk from Hucknall had been outwitted once more. There was talk of a 4th fight against Bendigo, with Caunt insisting it must happen on a raised stage so that the Nottingham lambs could not pervert proceedings. But this never materialised. Instead, Caunt pursued a successful career as landlord of the Coach and Horses, where he would entertain punters with his party trick, flattening a pint pewter pot with only the fingers of one hand. But disaster struck in 1851, when a fire broke out and 2 of his children perished in the flames. He would never be the same again, and eventually lost his licence, shortly after his wife passed away in 1859. He would join her 2 years later, dying in his sleep on 10th of September 1861, at the age of 46. He was buried in St. Mary Magdalene Parish in Hucknall, in the same church as Lord Byron. Rumour has it that more people visited his grave towards the end of the 19th century than that of the flamboyant poet, although this may be because the poet is buried inside the church, whereas Caunt is outside in the graveyard. Ben's final fight was the result of a family feud, and the kind of tantrum you'd expect to see on the Jeremy Kyle show. Nat Langham had married Caunt's cousin, and after some bitching and sniping from their respective wives, the men stepped in and decided to settle affairs in the ring on the 21st of September 1857. Nat was considered the best middleweight of his era, and had also worked as a farm labourer in Hinckley, so this was an even match. The fight lasted 60 rounds and ended in a draw when both were too exhausted to continue. In 2015, Caunt's fighting career is still going on, but this time the battle is with Westminster and the naming of the great clock, Big Ben. The 13-ton bell first rang out across London on the 31st of May 1859, and Parliament sat down and deliberated on a suitable name for this heavy load. During the nattering, the Chief Lord of the Woods and Forests, Sir Benjamin Hall, stood up and gave a long, ponderous speech. When it finally shut up, a Whig shouted out, Why not call him Big Ben and have done with it? The house erupted into laughter. The clock had a name. However, the validity of this story has been questioned in a booklet written for the Old Ministry of Works by Alan Phillips, in which he writes, "Like other nice stories, this has no documentary support. Hansard failed to record the interjection. The Times had been alluding to Big Ben of Westminster since 1856. Probably the derivation must be sought more remotely. The current champion of the prize ring was Benjamin Caunt, who had fought terrific battles with Bendigo and who in 1857 lasted 60 rounds of a drawn contest in his final appearance at the age of 42. As Caunt at one period scaled 17 stone, his nickname was Big Ben, and that was readily bestowed by the populace on any object the heaviest of its class. So the anonymous MP may have snatched at what was already a catchphrase. It's said that history is written by the winners, but in this instance, it's being written by the toffs. Therefore, the descendants of the former champion of England believe it is time to throw down the gauntlet and confront Westminster over what they perceive to be a rewriting of history. The establishment is arguably a more conniving opponent than Caunt's nemesis Bendigo, so they will have to keep their wits about them. If you want to help them, get in contact.